Hi, everybody. This is Christine Radke. I'm with the Water Research Foundation. Thank you so much for joining our webinar today on phosphorus recovery and management. Okay. Again, my name is Christine Radke. I'm one of the program directors here at the Research Foundation, and I'm also joined with my colleague, Michelle Suazo, who I forgot to add her photo. She will be helping us out on any technical issues. So if you have any questions about not being able to hear anything, you'll hear back from her on that. Before we get into the meat of our webcast, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. At any time, you can enter your questions. On the left-hand side of your screen, there's a question box. Type those in. You'll see when I get to show you the agenda, we are not going to have a specified Q&A period. We'd love the questions to come in throughout the speakers, and so that we can have this a little more interactive and have your questions answered in not waiting until the very end to answer your questions. Also, on the left-hand side of your screen, there's under the question box is an event resources. You'll find the PDF of the presentation today and also a handout, which I'll get to in a bit. We will have a survey at the very end of the webcast, and I really encourage you to fill that out for us so that we can see how we're doing and find out more of what you'd like WRF to do. If you do need professional development hours, please contact Michelle. Her email is up on the screen right now. And as I mentioned, the presentation is available right now, but the recording and the slides will also be available after this webcast on waterrf.org. All right, just to go through our agenda real quickly, well, this is the introduction and welcome. I'm going to just briefly touch about on our phosphorus recovery research that we're doing at the Foundation. And then we'll have Christian Kabe, who will give us an overview of P recovery technology implementations that have been documented in a global compendium. We've invited Matt Schultz from the Sustainable Phosphorus Alliance to give an introduction of what they do and how you guys can also get involved, since obviously if you're on this webinar, you care about phosphorus recovery. And then we'll also have Joseph Ziobro from EPA, and he will talk about the nutrient recycling challenge, which have been a few years in the running, and this is really an effort to accelerate the development of phosphorus recovery and nitrogen, even though this is focused on phosphorus. Okay, we're going to touch a little bit on nitrogen. And some of you may have heard that recently we signed a memorandum of understanding with EPA. We'll speak very briefly on that, and just, if you have questions about it, feel free to send them in. I'm not going to read the speaker bios because they are online. You can click on the screen and you'll see everyone's bio. But I really wanted to have more time for the speakers and for discussion. So before we get started, I'd like us to do a couple of polls just so we can gauge who our audience is. So the first question is, who do you work for? What is your background? We'll keep the poll open for about 15 seconds and would like to see who you work with. Michelle, how's the poll looking? Can we go ahead and close it?
Sure, let's go ahead and close it, and I'll send the results out.
Okay. Okay, so it looks like a majority of our attendees are from a utility. So this is great. I hope that you guys are interested in phosphorus recovery technologies. So maybe that's why you're here, and I hope we have the information for you. All right, let's go to our next poll question. What is your level of knowledge on phosphorus recovery? Are you an expert, like you already know and you're already doing phosphorus recovery at your facility, or you're already designing for it? Do you have enough to get by, like you're following the trends and you're almost pulling the trigger to implement phosphorus recovery, or are you a novice, like you just want to know what is it? What can I do? How can I implement it? Let's see, let's open the poll for that. Okay. And let's go ahead and close, give it another second or two. All right, let's go ahead and close the poll, Michelle. Thank you. It looks like we have a even number of people that know enough or they're novices on phosphorus recovery. So to our speakers, that is who our audience is. This is great. Well, I hope you get what you want and learn a lot about phosphorus recovery. Okay, so just real quickly, you know, in the last 10 years, there's been a shift in the water industry that, you know, we know it's not just about treating the wastewater to meet the permits and effluent, but also changing the mind shift of wastewater utilities being biofactories, if you will. We know that we can recover water for potable use and non-potable use. We know we can recover biosolids. In recent years, we found ways to recover energy and also nutrients. So, by the way, there's also research that we have ongoing or completed of seeing how we can recover bioplastics through like methane gas, looking at recovering rare earth elements. But it's a whole new mind shift that we're having here in our wastewater sector. So, in an effort to address this new mind shift, in 2010, WRF embarked in a resource recovery research program, if you will. And what I have up on the screen are the topics that we wanted to cover under this program. We did have a separate program for energy and a separate program for water reuse. So this one is really looking at nutrients for the most part, but also biosolids and other commodities, like I mentioned, bioplastics and rare earth elements. The phosphorus recovery research, I did want to point out, those projects have been completed, and I encourage you to go on our website, and if you're interested, you can download the report. There's also some tools. There's a tool called TWRF, the tool for evaluating resource recovery for phosphorus, and it's an Excel spreadsheet. And if you're interested in implementing and you don't know how to get started, or you want to see if it's even feasible for you, this is a great tool to get started on deciding on that. But I'm not saying that phosphorus recovery research is completely. There's still so much that we need to know. But in the recent years, we've been really focusing on looking at the technologies that are available, whether they've been implemented, and what people are actually seeing on the full-scale practices. So that leads us to our first speaker. One of the efforts that we had done with the Global Water Research Coalition and Stephanie Rink Pfeiffer is to pull together a compendium, if you will, of all the technologies that have been implemented. And that's on the left-hand side of your screen, the event resources. There's a fact sheet on this compendium. Christian is going to talk more about the compendium. He was our principal investigator for this project. If you do want a copy of the compendium, please send me an email and I'll find a way to get it to you. But with that, I will go ahead and pass it on to Christian.
Yes, thank you very much, Christine. So I'm pleased to be able to present some insights of the compendium we managed to compile over the last 1.5 years. And I would also like to thank Stephanie to get this somehow initiated within GWRC and to find the sponsors in this community. So what can you expect from this presentation is a short insight on the scope of the compendium. Then I will briefly explain some approaches of nutrient recovery, where and how. I will also reflect on some market issues and give you an outlook before I hand over to Matt. And besides that, might be an accident, but maybe not. This year we have the 350th anniversary of the discovery of phosphorus by German pharmacist Henning Brandt, based in Hamburg. The compendium itself is a kind of global state of implementation and also provides a mapping. So where are the hotspots on the planet for the implementation of peer recovery? But it's focusing on, let's say, centralized sanitation systems and on the technical peer recovery, not considering separation at source ideas, etc. It provides some technology TRLs, details, compiles a catalog of existing technologies out there, provides brief descriptions of concepts and where implementations make sense or not. Gives also some insights on operational benefits and also limitations. But recovery alone is more or less pointless if you are not able to bridge the gap between recovery and recycling. So the nutrients have to be fed back into the nutrient cycle. So value chains play here a very important role. And to trigger this, of course, you need an enabling environment reflected by the legal framework. So we still have some challenges there. And in the end, if you look at the market intelligence and development of the recent years, so we can note acceleration of implementation. At the end of the compendium, we will find a list of suppliers and initiatives coping with peer recovery, but also with nutrient management as a whole. If you look at the, let's say, key pillars of nutrient recycling in the wastewater sector, so everyone knows about biosolids, so that's the left pillar, what I call the traditional recycling route. But due to upcoming issues, be it concerns about quality, hygiene, etc., there's a growing demand for finding alternative routes, so where such application on land is no longer possible, and to keep the recycling rate up and running. There you can look at the liquid phase of the sludge or the solid phase of the sludge, mainly represented by ashes. Once the left pillar is phasing down or even out in some countries, you have to go the other routes to keep the peer recovery and recycling potential up and running. And now the challenge is really to make the shift from discussing about alternative routes to implement them actually on the market. We still have a very broad range or diversity of biosolids application or disposal routes. So the range is from 100% incineration to 100% direct application in Europe. If you look at the US, we have around about 50% of land application and then some percentages in different other routes. On a global implementation, so this table reflects a kind of inventory of installations I had on radar. We see that the technical peer recovery within the sludge drain on-site wastewater treatment plants is the most matured so far. And there are also the most installations. And the most prominent representative in this direction is the struvite recovery. I think most of you already heard about it. So more than 100 full-scale recovery plants we have already up and running, and more than 80 are struvite recovery units, and 60 are municipal-based. Others are in industrial streams like dairy industry or potato processing, so it's food industry-based wastewater. And then on the right-hand side, you see the upcoming implementation of the, let's say, solid or ash-based route, so that's still at the brink to the market. If you look at the global map, we recognize 3 hotspots regions, so it's North America, Europe, and Japan. Just to give you a brief overview, of course, recovery alone has a kind of limitation if it's done on-site wastewater treatment plant, but there are some modules you can boost the recovery rates and also tap synergies, be it with energy recovery or also with nitrogen recovery. The blue technologies are, let's say, replicated on the market already. And if you look at the lower part of the slide, you see the solid phase or ash-based route. So that's still on the brink to the market. There are 2 plants up and running in Japan. In Europe, we are currently starting to implement several technologies, but they are still under construction. But you can also use ashes, for instance, as a kind of partly substitute for phosphate rock, which is currently done by ICL in Amsterdam. But what we definitely notice now is a kind of wind of change. So here are some issues that trigger more or less the evolution of nutrient recycling in the wastewater sector. And the red one is, I think, the most important from the utility perspective. You have to make sure for the long-term future that you can legally dispose your biosolids or valorize them. And if you have no land area available to put all the biosolids there, you have to find alternative routes, and in most cases that will be the incineration route. But there are also other issues like competition with other nutrient flows, be it manure or digestate. In the end, you can always link the pressure on the nutrient recycling to the population density and the livestock density. You probably heard about the recent developments on the legal base. So besides Switzerland, Germany is the first country to implement hard targets for phosphorus recovery from sewage. So back in the year 2017, several regulations have been adopted. So on the top, you see the fertilizing ordinance, which is a kind of national implementation of the nitrates directive, limiting actually the nutrient loads being allowed to put on land. So that's a very, very acute impact because that was implemented and enforced without any transition period. Then you have new fertilizer regulations, not only Germany, the European one is currently under revision and probably enters into force later this year with a transition phase of 3 years. So by 2022, there are probably also new standards from the European side. And most popular, the new sewage sludge ordinance in Germany, setting recovery targets for phosphorus for the bigger wastewater treatment plants, meaning the ones above 100,000 person equivalents starting from 2029 or 2032 for the ones bigger than 50,000 person equivalents. So some issues there. So if you want to recover phosphorus on site, your wastewater treatment plant, which will then only make sense if you have a co-incineration facility nearby, and your sludge contains more than 20 grams phosphorus per dry solids, then you have to deplete your sludge below this value to be allowed to incinerate your sludge in co-incineration plants, be it coal-firing, cement works, or municipal waste incinerators. Or you go to mono-incineration, which means that you exclusively incinerate your sludge without dilution with other waste streams. And then you are obliged to store your ash recoverable and separate from other waste, or to directly recover phosphorus from the ash by 80%. These new regulations had an acute impact due to the fertilizing ordinance. The land area available for sludge application or disposal dramatically cut down. So the disposal costs more or less exploded back in 2017 and 18. And in the midterm, there will be more incineration facilities in Germany, and I will explain it in the next slides. On the left-hand side, you see a map. The red dots are the ones already up and running, and the blue ones are already announced new projects. So we currently have, on a weekly basis, new announcements for new incineration units. So we currently count around about 30 new incinerators in Germany, which will more or less double the whole mono incineration capacity in the country in the coming 5 to 7 years, which is then also compliant with the regulation. So we would need to incinerate 1.2 million tons dry solids of sludge to comply with the regulation, but it's even likely that there will be more capacity. But this in the end provides a potential for phosphorus recovery from ash of around about 50,000 tons per year. If you compare it to the mineral P imports of Germany, accounting to 100 to 120,000 tons per year. So it's a replacement potential of around about 40 to 50%. If we look from the operator's perspective, we could have peer recovery on-site your wastewater treatment plant, which will also mean that you recover phosphorus side by side. So in these terms, it will be a kind of decentralized recovery design. Or downstream, then you can have the potential to cluster and to centralize your recovery potential. If we apply the new regulation, wastewater treatment plants above 50,000 person equivalents will be prohibited to put their sludge on land anymore. So this route will be closed by 2029 at the latest, or 32 at the latest. If you want to recover phosphorus on-site your wastewater treatment plant, then you have to deplete the P content below 2% or 20 grams P per dry solids. And of course, it will only make sense if you have a nearby co-incineration capacity you can use. Otherwise, you have to go to mono-incineration, and then of course, it wouldn't make sense to recover P on-site your wastewater treatment plant unless, like in the case for struvite, you have the need from the operational point of view to get rid of struvite incrustations you don't want, or if you have, for instance, a nearby customer being keen to buy the struvite, or you reduce your sludge volume, then of course it also makes sense. Just to give you one example, so there could be much more, but of course we could speak a whole day on phosphorus recovery, so that's just one example I picked to show you that it's possible to combine peer recovery also with the recovery of energy and nitrogen. Because the bigger plants already have digesters in place, you can trigger the biodegradation within the digesters by sludge disintegration, for instance, like applying thermal hydrolysis, which not only increases your biogas yield, it also increases your P redissolution, which will then allow to recover more phosphorus, which is dissolved in the aqueous phase of the sludge, be it as struvite or other crystallized materials. And since you have to lift the pH already to recover struvite, the way to ammonia stripping is no longer too far, so you just have to add some caustic. And if you have a problem with your ammonia return load, then of course it would make sense also to strip the ammonia or to recover the ammonia in a different way instead of just blowing it back into the air. So then you have the so-called C, N, and P recovery cascade. If you look at the global implementation, so far peer recovery was not the only trigger, or let's say not a real trigger at all. Most installations have been installed due to operational needs, be it incrustations or to improve your sludge treatment train as a whole. And then, of course, reduce your costs for sludge disposal. But peer recovery alone cannot be seen as a driver to implement on-site wastewater treatment plants. If you look downstream options, that's just one overview table. So there are different approaches. And if you look at them, it's not here described, but in the compendium, the only option to really separate the phosphorus from the heavy metals in an effective way is by leaching the ash with mineral acids, and then to have a sequence of separation steps to really detoxify the phosphorus component from the other nasty stuff. And this way you can also achieve or obtain defined products in the end. There are also other approaches like thermal conversions or even smelting, but these are not as effective in terms of heavy metal depletion as the leaching ones. So my conclusion in terms of technology approaches and market replication is, in the end, only technologies yielding homogeneous products or raw materials for other, let's say, industries or processes being as independent as possible from the input quality, but guaranteeing a very, let's say, defined output quality and mutually meeting energy efficiency and resource efficiency will have a real chance for, let's say, widespread application if it comes to sustainability aspects. So the keys, in fact, are real heavy metal depletion to achieve high quality products not some undefined materials. Moderate energy and chemicals consumption, which is of course also a cost driver and an issue for resource efficiency. And of course, since we want to reduce waste instead of increasing the volumes, in the end, we should have less waste after processing than before. And what we also learned in the recent years, it's much, much easier to place P products on the market if they are already known on the market. So then you have the chance for real value creation and you get a positive price for it. Now turning to the value chain approach, of course recovery is one thing, but if you want to recycle, then of course you have to bring the nutrients back into the nutrient cycle, or let's say industrial cycles. And so far we still have some challenges. So alone the definition, what is waste, what is a raw material, what is a product, turns out to be one of the biggest barriers we still have to cope with. So still the answer is the question of origin. So waste-derived material has, let's say, bad reputation, and also on a legal base, let's say, discriminated status compared to primary-based materials. So to solve this, one thing is to produce commodities which are already established on the market, or like in struvite, to have a very unique and very efficient material with new properties that really provides also new opportunities in application and for the environment. So if you compare, let's say, the traditional sludge or biosolids application with what I call the new defined commodities or commercial recovered pure recyclates, the new ones really allow to produce defined adjustable fertilizing materials with defined efficiency and composition. They reduce the contaminants within the matrix in a very efficient way. They also reduce, depending on the water solubility, of course, of the nutrients, the losses to the environment. So you can also prevent eutrophication in your region. In best case, your material is already established on the market. Then, of course, the bureaucratic burden to get it placed on the market is far, far lower than having a new design material no one already knows. So then you have to go through the whole registration processes, etc., which also are very heterogeneous around the globe. And then, of course, if you have an established material, you already have opportunity to create real value out of it. And if you have a defined material which is known in different markets, then of course you also increase the versatility of application. Challenges are still that we have to cope with missing level playing fields, meaning primary-based materials are accepted, whereas waste-derived materials still have to cope with different issues. In some cases, of course, you have to invest before you can tap. And what we also experience, progress very often needs legislative motivation, or in worst case, pressure. So here we can say the legal framework is still from the last century and still needs to become an enabling framework for circular economy.
Christian,
Yep.
Before you proceed, I do have a couple of questions that came in.
Okay.
If you don't mind answering. This one is from Mandy from the UK. She's asking, in legal terms, are the recovered phosphorus products considered as products or waste in Germany? And is there actually a good market demand for the products?
So far, if you speak about the demand, it's still, let's say, beyond radar. So, but that's also an issue of knowledge. So in most cases, people don't know that there is some material on the market which has been recovered from waste. So, but I think that can be solved even without the legal issues. That's a question of marketing. The legal status of different materials is also very heterogeneous. In best case, like in case of struvite, it's somehow listed or reflected in the fertilizer regulation. and then you can bring it back to the market as a fertilizer. But then you also have the issue, and there I know there are different interpretations between UK and Germany, for instance. If it comes to REACH, what is a recovered material? So in the UK, the interpretation is, okay, you don't need to do the REACH process in the UK, but in Germany, if you want to be on the safe side, you have to. And that's just, let's say, one example. So also the legal status is very heterogeneous between the different European member states. And my big hope is that the new fertilizer regulation currently under processing of the Commission will kind of trigger a kind of harmonization and allow to have easier, let's say, recycling through the continent.
Okay, thanks. And if I may, there's one other question that's Germany specific. This is from Debbie in California, from the Central Valley Clean Water Association. So it's nice to see that Germany is embracing phosphorus recovery, but do you think that they're embracing it because there are regulations that discourage incineration, or is it a forward-thinking country?
So if you speak of Germany, their incineration is let's say favored, especially mono incineration, because in Germany there are too much nutrients in the wrong place. So farmers used to recycle their own nutrients, be it manure or digestate. So there's no more, let's say, space for sludge. And of course, it's easier to export it to the east. But of course, since the globe is a globe, what you export to the east will come back from the west one day. So, and then of course, incineration is still the best option to reduce the volume and also to get rid of the organic pollutants. And the big advantage of separate incineration of sludge is that you really concentrate the phosphorus. Of course, you also concentrate the heavy metals, but there are technologies already out there enabling us to really separate the phosphorus and the heavy metals in a very effective way. And then, of course, you can produce defined products. If you look at biosolids, it's always a trick to store them on a safe way. And then, of course, if it comes to fertilizers are not used through the year. So you have your fertilizing season, and the rest of the year you need storage capacities. And mineral solids can be easily stored. So that's not an issue. So to be honest, I'm in favor of the incineration route.
Okay. That's your personal opinion, right?
Yeah.
Just again, a couple more questions, real quickly. Speaking of other materials in the biosolids, and this comes from Carl, are you seeing issues with PFAS in the EU, and if it's affecting the biosolids and phosphorus recovery? You know, that's a major issue that we're tackling here in the U.S. right now.
So PFAS is indeed an issue, and that's also one of the reasons I'm favoring incineration. So then you solve this problem. And but there are in some member states there's also already a kind of limit value for PFOS and PFOA. So that's let's say the two most popular perfluorinated compounds. But in the end, limit values are always a kind of political compromise and somehow linked also to the capability of your chemical analysis methods. So in the end, you can only see what you know and what you can measure. So no one really knows what's in the whole matrix. So in the end, you find the whole periodic table in the biosolids because they are the pollutant sink of the, let's say, anthroposphere.
Okay, thanks. And looking at your wrap up and outlook, it looks like you might have answered some of the questions that I just asked you. But let's go ahead and please go ahead and continue your presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. So And what's also quite remarkable, having all these, let's say, discussions about phosphorus and the necessity to recover in mind. So there was always a scarcity discussion. But what I noticed when I was diving into the topic deeper and deeper, that, let's say, the front runners are not actually coping with scarcity. They are coping with surplus in certain regions. So in Europe, it's the Netherlands, Flanders, some parts of Germany. So, and that's always linked to the ratio of population and livestock density compared to the territory available to put the nutrients back to the land. So, and that's also one point, since massive livestock production is not really going down, it's rather increasing in some regions. So the pressure or the competition between manure and sludge is increasing in certain regions. So then, of course, farmers are more in favor of their own stuff instead of importing other wastes. So the sludge has to go somewhere else. And here I always come back to the incineration and then to produce mineral concentrates you can store and easily ship somewhere else. And yeah, what we also see in Germany now, so a lot of our neighboring countries are now having a closer look on our legislation and how it's going to be implemented, and what issues are the utilities having to cope with, etc. So what I see already is a kind of tidal wave that is starting in Germany and then spreading out on the perimeter to the neighboring countries. I also want to say, if you want to recover on-site your wastewater treatment plant, what we see in implementational terms, it's always needing to be linked to operational needs. So no one is just doing peer recovery on-site for fun. So if it's linked to operational benefits like reduced sludge volume, reduced disposal costs, less, let's say, trouble in operations, then you can also be sure that you have a short ROI. And again, coming back to the ash root provides the highest recovery potential, and the charming point here is also that you have the smallest volume and the highest concentration of phosphorus you need to treat. And very important to really come back to the recycling of the nutrients, that you go for known materials instead of developing a technology that ends up with completely unknown key recyclates no one really wants to have. So that's really hard to get them back into the market. So the easiest way is to have defined commodities which are already established and known. But also, and now I break the lance for the nitrogen guys. Of course, phosphorus is just one macronutrient. One nutrient alone will not feed the world. So we have to really switch from this very isolated look at different issues and challenges of these days to get more holistic and have more the systemic approach. That's the next evolutionary step. And that, I think, is also for the research needs of the future, to really see the interactions between the different issues we have more or less tackled in isolation in the past. And with that, so I started with the famous German, and I will also finish with the famous German. But let me stress also the importance. So in the end, we know why phosphorus recovery is necessary and how it can be done. So why don't we do it? And to really get into the implementation stage and replication stage, multi-stakeholder engagement and collaboration is key. And here are just 3 examples of the 3 hotspots regions: the European Sustainable Phosphorus Platform, the Sustainable Phosphorus Alliance in America, and also the Phosphorus, Industry Development Organization in Japan. 3, let's say, good examples how stakeholders can be brought together and initiate a collaboration to achieve implementation and replication. Having said that, so one of the most famous German poets, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, said once, "Knowing is not enough, we must apply. Willing is not enough, we must do." Or in other words, all the wisdom we have put on paper will be dust one day. So the only chance we have to really make our own future sustainable is to apply our wisdom. So there's no point in just writing, speaking. And with that, of course, every project needs some budget. And here I would like to thank the partners of GWRC who have put some money into the project and allowed us to compile this nice compendium. And with that, I would like to hand over to Matt.
Thanks so much, Christian. Christine, can you hear me? Did you want to transition?
I hear you, Matt.
Do you want me to just launch, or did you want? Okay, great. Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Matt Schultz, and I'm the program manager from the Sustainable Phosphorus Alliance. And I'm really excited to be here because I feel like I've made it in the world. To be on a panel with Christian Kaba and Joseph Ciobra, I'm surprised Elon Musk isn't part of this panel now. I'm very excited. So I'd like to talk to you a little bit today about the Sustainable Phosphorus Alliance and tell you about some of the resources that we have available to the community. I want to sort of frame this by thinking a little bit about phosphorus sustainability in a larger sense. And I think it's very easy coming from the water sector to kind of think of phosphorus as a terrible thing. It's a pollutant that has to be removed from the waste streams. It's costly in terms of struvite buildup on unit processes and that sort of thing. And it's easy to forget that it's actually a fantastic resource too. And I think WRF has really been progressive about advancing this paradigm shift from thinking of phosphorus as simply a waste product to a recoverable resource that we need to take care of. And it really is a super important resource, and it isn't evil, as the slide says. I think I got into this field, one of the things that really got me excited about it was my boss, Jim Elser, had given a talk, and he started out the talk by asking people, where do your bones come from? And I think that's a great question, and if you trace it back and you think about it, the answer, if you're a North American, is probably Tampa. Your bones come from Tampa. And the reason is that a lot of the phosphate mines in the United States, in fact, most of the phosphate production in the United States happens in that area of Florida. And that phosphorus is what's used to build your bones. But also phosphorus is found throughout the body. It's built into adenosine triphosphate, which is the energy currency of all your cells. It's built into your cell membranes in the phospholipid bilayer. It's what holds your DNA together through the phosphodiester bonds. It's absolute requirement for life, and that's true not just for humans, but it's everything down to viruses have an absolute requirement for phosphorus. It does have this fiery nature that I'm going to talk about. I like to build this analogy between phosphorus and fire in this sense. Phosphorus, or fire, if it's in your house and it's in your fireplace or it's in your grill, it's very useful. It could be even invaluable, you might say, for keeping you warm. And likewise, phosphorus, excuse me, when it's applied in the right time and the right place, is absolutely invaluable to agriculture. And of course, we need agriculture in order to live, or we need food in order to live, I should say. But when phosphorus isn't contained, it's like a wildfire. It can be extraordinarily ecologically devastating, economically devastating. And I think of the algal bloom really as kind of the forest fire equivalent of what happens to lakes. This is a huge problem. It's not just a fringe problem that we need to think about on the periphery. To give you an idea of how bad the problem is, the National Lakes Assessment that was done in 2012 found that 40% of U.S. lakes are in the most disturbed condition for total phosphorus. And 46% of the rivers and streams in the U.S. had high levels of phosphorus, according to National Rivers and Streams Assessment. So this is approaching half of the water in the U.S. is being polluted by phosphorus. So it's a huge problem, and a lot of it's being shouldered a lot, of course, by the water treatment sector, but it's also a all hands on deck sort of problem. We really need to get everyone involved in making phosphorus more sustainable. It has a very complex value chain, and you can kind of see that in this diagram. It starts with mining and beneficiation from the ground, and it goes all the way through the food system through the waste system, through organic municipal waste. And all these players along the way have a role in making phosphorus more sustainable in its use. And as you can see by all these arrows going to and fro, there are many opportunities in this value chain for nutrient recycling to happen between the various nodes. And I think the water treatment industry is kind of central to this. Water is really the natural sink for phosphorus, if you think about it. It's applied to the soil, but then it erodes away eventually. It gets washed off with precipitation, and it ends up in the water. And so you all get to deal with that, right? Which is kind of a blessing and a curse. It's a curse because it's an expensive problem to deal with, but you're given this tremendous resource that you can recycle, and you can help make our waters clearer and purer, and make our future more sustainable by doing that. And so I think WRF really gets this, and they've gotten it through programs like LIFT and others where they understand that there needs to be sort of this multi-stakeholder engagement that Christian mentioned. We really need to have everybody working together because there are a lot of opportunities that cross sectors for recycling these materials and for using them more sustainably. I was lucky enough to work with Christine and some others at WRF on helping to shape one of their recent RFPs, which was called New Approaches for Improved Nutrient Management. And if you read the objective statement of this RFP, you see all of these terms embedded in it about engaging stakeholders from the point and non-point source communities, about adopting holistic approaches to nutrient management, about adopting watershed-based approaches. This is exactly what we need, and I think WRF's to be commended, and its members are to be commended for being very proactive in reaching out to other industries to try to address the phosphorus sustainability problem. And of course, we're also in that league. WRF is one of our founding members, and we're very grateful to them for that. And we have a large group of members. We're a member-funded organization, and we're really focused on how we can promote the more sustainable use, recovery, and recycling of phosphorus in the food system throughout the whole food system. And you'll notice a lot of these names on this members list and founding current members and strategic partners list are ones that will be familiar to you. People like NACWA, WRF, Ostera, Renewable Nutrients, and some of our partners, WEF and NIBRA, of course. But some of them probably are not very familiar to you. So OCP, which is the Moroccan company that owns the largest reserves of phosphate in the world. They own 71% of the reserves Morocco does. The Sustainability Consortium, which writes retail supply chain metrics for companies, retailers like Walmart and Amazon. Biochar Now and Green Edge Technologies, these are companies that deal with organic residuals recycling. We bring all these people together into our forum to help address some of these challenges. And so what does that mean? What do we actually do? Well, one of the things we do is we facilitate networking among these different groups, and we do that by having an annual conference, and I'll have a slide on that at the end here. We also produce technical content that helps people generate discussions, and we do sort of traditional outreach in terms of social media, newsletter, et cetera. We also orchestrate working groups, and I'll get into some of that work in the next couple of slides. We provide technical input, including to the RFP that I mentioned, but also to other groups. We represent the North American phosphorus sustainability community, both here and within that global collective of platforms that Christian had mentioned. And we offer a branding opportunity to organizations who want to show that they're doing good work in phosphorus sustainability. Okay, so now that you've had that background, let me tell you a little bit about what resources we have to offer you right now. One thing we have is we have over 15 hours of video footage on peace sustainability up on our YouTube channel. So you can go to YouTube and look at Sustainable Phosphorus Alliance, and you'll find this. If you ever have a date, this is a fantastic opportunity. 15 hours of video footage. What else could you ask for? Two of those things I want to point out are our Sustainable Phosphorus webinar series, which operates similar to this webinar that you're seeing today. We have a panel of people who discuss certain topics. We've done a couple on nutrient recycling, in fact. We also have another offering called Phosphorus Science Now, where I sit down with the authors of recent journal articles in the realm of phosphorus sustainability and talk to them about their papers and kind of go through it. And this is really a way for people to keep on top of the literature without necessarily having journal subscriptions or having 2 hours to sit down and scour a journal article. And so those are available for free right now. You can get on the web and look at those. We also have technical working groups I mentioned. One of those is the Biosolids and Manure Task Force. And we started this group because we started thinking about ways that policy could help inform better practices or inspire better practices in terms of nutrient recycling for organic residuals. And we realized, man, the policy landscape is really complex because each of the states has their own set of regulations that governs, for example, how biosolids and manure are land applied. And so we decided we wanted to do a landscape analysis of this policy landscape. And we assembled a team of industry and government advisors and asked them for their input on what is the most important information that we can extract from the state regulations and federal regulations on biosolids and manure land application. We built a template, and then we went through and read thousands and thousands of pages of code from each of the 50 states, extracted the information into that template that we built, and then we took that compendium of information and vetted it with regulators from each of the 50 states and embedded all that information into an online tool. And this is going to be released on April 5th. It's called GIS-P, and the idea is that you can go to this online platform, look at a map of the United States, and we're going to build Canada into this too. We've already started on that. Click on the state or the province, find out what the regulatory regime is, and then we've contextualized that data by layering on other data sets that are relevant. For example, farm data sets, impaired water data sets, that sort of thing, so that you can see how the policy interacts with the nutrient flows in the 50 states and hopefully, soon in Canada as well. This also will be free and available to you. We want people to adopt this, so I'm happy to work with you in finding ways that we can use this in your own scenario development exercises. I know a lot of you on the line are from the policy sphere according to the poll, and so this should be a great tool for you to use if you want to do state-to-state comparisons and see what your neighbor state is doing in terms of biosolids, regulation of biosolids land application or manure land application. So again, April 5th. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, quick question. Is this GIS-P or
GIS-P?
GIS-P. Is it is it going to be updated on a regular basis?
Yeah, so that will of course be funding dependent. We'll see how things go, but the plan is there's not a lot of this stuff doesn't get updated very often, right? So the regulations tend to be fixed for a long time. Some of the data sets that come out are several years old, and they probably will only get updated every several years. So we'll try to keep it updated as much as we can, and we certainly want to keep contact with the regulators who have been reviewing the regulatory data that we're embedding in this, and hopefully get them to be, treat this a little bit like a wiki where they can send us information and update it that way.
Very cool. I've marked April 5th on my calendar.
Yeah, it's going to be a big day. You should buy champagne.
Yeah.
It's going to be really exciting. Yeah, just don't crash our servers. I'll talk. We'll have a talk on this at the Phosphorus forums, and I'll talk about that on my last slide too. Another one of our working groups is the Phosphorus Field-to-Watershed Modeling group, and I'm going to kind of gloss over this in the interest of time, but I want to just kind of frame it this way. We tend to monitor and evaluate. There's kind of this classic environmental problem where we tend to monitor and evaluate environmental harms at large scales. So, for example, we look at the global climate or we look at pollution in the Mississippi River. But the interventions that are required to tackle that problem tend to be diffuse and small scale. And there's often a problem connecting those two things to show that these diffuse small scale changes will lead to these more consequential large scale solutions. And that's true in agriculture for sure, where farmers can implement best management practices, but they don't necessarily have faith that those are going to lead to watershed scale outcomes, and policy regulators are kind of left in the same boat. And so we're trying to build better connectivity between these on-farm models for how nutrients are transported from farm fields or out of farm fields, and how best management practices impact those flows, and then how those practices all scale up to watershed scale impacts. And if you have questions about that, my email will be on the end of this, and we can also hit some of that in the Q&A. But that's the idea behind this. Another program that we have is, and we're launching this on April 5th as well. I'm very excited about this one. It's called the Phosphorus Sustainability Challenge, and we've been working on this for quite some time. One of the issues with phosphorus sustainability is no one knows what phosphorus is. You all do because you work in this field, but most people don't know in the public sphere. And in fact, if you scour corporate social responsibility reports and look at their goals, most companies, really, I should say basically all companies in the Fortune 500, don't treat phosphorus sustainability per se as a major environmental issue, and it is a major environmental issue. It's right up there with some of the other major ones you think about, like deforestation, for example. And we need to raise the profile of this issue for several reasons. One, it just needs to happen in order to affect more sustainable outcomes. But it also, we want to highlight all the good work that people like you, or some of you, are doing in doing phosphorus recovery. This is really important work that's being done, and you need to get kudos. And we need to show that there's collective action, and sort of galvanize more action, create some energy around this issue. And so we've launched this Phosphorus Sustainability Challenge, which is essentially a public commitment platform where any organization, that means a government organization, it means a private company, it means a small organization, it means a big organization, can make a public commitment to lowering their phosphorus footprint. That can mean making their use of phosphorus more sustainable, or recovering and recycling in responsible ways phosphorus back into the food system. And so this is modeled after something that Conservation International did with their Sustainable Coffee Challenge. And we want to use this to raise awareness about the issues and hopefully get companies especially to realize that, hey, they need to embed this into their corporate social responsibility reporting and drive that through their supply chains, and also get you recognition for the work that you're doing at the same time and raise the public awareness about what these important issues are. So please look for this. Please do participate in this. This is open to you. It's free to participate in the challenge. And your organizations, we really would love to have you involved. So please do get involved. And that's one way you can engage us. My favorite way for you to engage us is to join us as members. None of this work we do, of course, is free. I'm cheap, but I'm not that cheap. And so we need money to come in the door. And so we need organizations to join, step up, write a check, and say this is something that we support and we want to move forward. We also need you in our network so that we can build this multi-stakeholder collaboration that we've all been talking about. You can also, there are sponsorship opportunities as well if you want to go that route. Please do participate in the Phosphorus Sustainability Challenge, and please also come to our Phosphorus Forum, which is happening just in a couple weeks. This is happening during Water Week. It's the Friday of Water Week, which I think is the second to last day. It's in Washington, D.C., right by the Capitol. We have a fantastic set of speakers, including my friend and our advisor, Dr. Bruce Rittman, who won the Stockholm Water Prize last year. He shared that prize. Also, Dr. Kathleen Merrigan, who was the Deputy Secretary of Agriculture under President Obama. Patrick Doobie from WEF will be there. And we'll be talking about all these various programs that I've just outlined. One of those programs I mentioned already was that Biosolids and Manure Task Force that developed the GIS-P program that Christine was asking about. And Joseph Ciobro, our next speaker, actually helped me in the early stages of that project, and he sat on that advisory committee that helped us develop those early templates. He's really knowledgeable about nutrient recycling, and I'm excited to set him up for the next talk. So with that, Christine, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, great. And folks that are attending, if it will also entice you to attend the forum, I will also be in attendance. So it will be a party. I do have a couple of questions real quick before we get Joseph. back to the GIS-P, Peter is asking if European regulations would ever be included, or is there something similar with like the European Sustainable Phosphorus Group?
I'm not familiar with anything that they're doing that's exactly like this. Chris Thornton and I talk quite a bit together, and maybe when we roll this out, we can talk about collaborating if he's interested in looking at building out something similar for Europe. We're not jealously guarding this. This is something that's meant to be publicly useful, and so if we can build a framework for others to use, we're happy to do that.
Okay, thanks. And then one last comment question. So you mentioned several places where we do mine phosphorus, like in Florida and Morocco. Kaoru from Canada went to a lecture about 10 years ago, and they were talking about there's going to be a major phosphorus shortage in the future. Are you, I guess we're still trending on that, correct?
No. No. 10 years ago, that was absolutely the story. And what happened was right around then, there was a major recalculation of our phosphate reserves. And so we really don't push the demand problem of phosphorus so much in that sense. Our world resources of phosphate rock are more than 300 billion tons. And actually, the reserved production ratio of phosphorus is one of the highest among all of the mineral commodities. There are places though that are certainly phosphorus poor, and they're kind of witnessing local problems with this. And certainly Europe is completely dependent on imports. The demand side problem has more to do, I think, today with the concentration of those phosphate reserves. So 71% of those reserves are concentrated in just Morocco, if you think, and so that's kind of OPEC level concentrations of that natural resource, and it's a far more important natural resource than oil. We can live without oil, we can't live without phosphorus. So when you think about it in those terms, there is a stratification issue that I think we need to address, and recycling is one way that we can do that for sure.
Okay. Yeah, so I still think we need to support these recovery technologies as well. So,
absolutely.
Yeah, so with that, I think that's a good segue to bring up our next speaker, Joseph.
Thanks very much, Christine. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, we hear you.
So I'm Joseph Ziobro, and I'm with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and also humbled to be speaking here today alongside of Christian and Matt. And thank you to the Water Research Foundation for asking us to be a part of this webinar. I'm going to go ahead and talk a little bit about a project that emerged out of EPA's Office of Wastewater Management in 2015 called the Nutrient Recycling Challenge. And what I'd like to do is give a bit of historic perspective about what the challenge was and is and what happened. Talk a little bit about the evolution of the challenge from the beginning to the conclusion of phase 2, and then also talk a bit about some of the ways that we are thinking of working with the Water Research Foundation and others to build on some of the successes from phase 1 and 2 of the Nutrient Recycling Challenge. So one thing I wanted to draw attention to here briefly is our planning committees in phase 1 and 2 of the Nutrient Recycling Challenge. You can see we had a rather large group of stakeholders that were involved in the planning and launching of the Nutrient Recycling Challenge. And I'll talk about that a little bit more on a future slide when I'm talking about the project genesis. Just wanted to call your attention to that and let you know that EPA alone could never have launched the Nutrient Recycling Challenge, and we're really grateful to all these partners. And you can see, I'll just call out a few. We worked closely with the United States Department of Agriculture and the Department of Energy, as well as some of the largest producers of pork and milk products in the country, and we really wanted to make sure that we were incorporating a producer's perspective throughout the course of the Nutrient Recycling Challenge. So as you may have guessed from the photo there in the upper left corner of the cow and the pig, we will be shifting gears slightly and talking about phosphorus recovery and nitrogen recovery, some in the context of animal manure and very specifically swine and dairy manure. So on the next slide here, I have the goals of the Nutrient Recycling Challenge highlighted, and at its core, the Nutrient Recycling Challenge was designed as a prize competition that was meant to accelerate the development of technologies that pork and dairy farms could use that could provide them with some manure management benefits as well as economic benefits. And we also wanted to increase awareness of issues and opportunities related to nutrients and manure management more generally. As both Matt and Christian alluded to, there's certainly an acknowledgement here that recovery of nutrients is a great opportunity in the country and globally, and we wanted to make sure that we essentially were having the right folks talk to each other, and that sort of goes into the next bullet, connecting innovators and agricultural stakeholders. At the sort of onset of this project, we learned pretty quickly that in some cases there were folks who had been working on nutrient recovery technologies, perhaps in the municipal waste treatment realm for quite a while, had a lot of practical and technical experience with technologies that can create value-added products from various waste streams, but that hadn't necessarily worked on manure and hadn't necessarily worked with farmers. And obviously there are quite a few differences between publicly operated treatment works and farms and how they operate and how they run as businesses and the waste streams themselves. So of course we wanted to make sure that we were having those folks who have been in the lab working on these technologies, talking to the end users of the technologies and really ground truthing some of those concepts. Finally here, we wanted to focus on stimulating the markets for the products that can be generated by nutrient recovery technologies. So I would, stay up early and talk about it a bit more as I go along, that one of the major barriers that we identified pretty early on in the process to more widespread use of nutrient recovery technologies in the livestock sector is the immaturity of or lack of markets for the products that can be generated by those technologies and their sometimes inability to compete with already commercially available fertilizer products on the market. So as I mentioned, I'll go back to the sort of beginning and say just a bit about how this project came to be and some of the early discussions and some of the barriers and how we envisioned structuring the competition. So in early 2015, there was a real interest in the senior leadership at EPA to sort of characterize the current state of nutrient recovery technologies in the livestock sector. We had been hearing a lot at EPA that there were these technologies that could create value-added products and essentially give producers new manure management options, could potentially generate some new revenues from the sale of those products or avoidance costs, just making manure management a little easier on their operations, making their storage more convenient, whatever the case may be, that there were some benefits and there were technologies that could potentially provide producers with those benefits. However, we certainly, as I mentioned, realized that in order to get a sense of what was going on, we would have to talk to a broad array of stakeholders. One thing I will touch on very quickly is the fact that in the Office of Wastewater Management at the Environmental Protection Agency is at its heart a regulatory office that is responsible for implementation and oversight of the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination, so NPDES permitting system. That is the sort of permitting program for wastewater discharges in the country, and that's including municipal discharges, stormwater discharges, vessel discharges, manure discharges on CAFOs, all sorts of discharges. So though we are a regulatory office, there's also a very strong acknowledgement within the Office of Wastewater Management that partnership programs and collaborations can definitely supplement that regulatory program and get at some nutrient reductions that can't necessarily be achieved through regulation alone. So we do have an array of partnership programs and have had the fortune to work very closely with a number of agricultural stakeholders over the last several years to try to get at some of those issues that might fall outside of the realm of, say, point source and into the non-point source realm. And even though something may not be required from a regulatory perspective, we know for a fact that there are lots of farmers out there who are trying to be as innovative as possible, trying to improve the state of their farm and leave it better for their next generation. So we wanted to capitalize on that and work with those stakeholders throughout the process. So thinking back to the slide where we had about a 20-organization planning committee, we wanted to make absolutely sure that we had a good diversity of producer perspectives represented on the planning committee. So you may have seen some of the companies we worked with, like Cabot Cheese and Dairy Farmers of America, some of the milk cooperatives, as well as Ben & Jerry's. And then on the swine side, companies like Smithfield and Tyson's, and as well as the National Pork Producers Council. And then we also worked very closely with some of the organizations that have been doing a lot of great research in the area of nutrient recovery technology, such as Innovation Center for U.S. Dairy and Nutrient, as well as our federal colleagues at USDA Agricultural Research Service, and a number of other professional organizations, including Water Research Foundation, who, of course, we knew has done quite a bit of research on nutrient recovery technology in general. So with that said, we had a kind of discussion in the early days, this regulatory office within the EPA with a lot of great connections in the stakeholder in the agricultural sector. We were sort of able to pick up the phone and have some conversations with farmers and the cooperatives and the integrators and say, what is it that you've been trying to do in terms of nutrient recovery? Are you interested in these technologies? Have you installed them? Have they worked? If not, what hasn't worked? And some of the barriers here I've identified are the principal ones that came up time and time again, that the systems were often very expensive, both in terms of capital costs and operation and maintenance costs. Again, the immature absent markets for the co-products the systems generate. High system complexity. Of course, some of these technologies are functionally mini wastewater treatment plants on a farm that may have only been sort of in use those larger settings, a million-gallon-a-day municipal waste treatment works. So what does that mean in terms of how the farmer can use and operate that technology? And then, as I also sort of briefly touched on, we really learned that there was this kind of gap between the end users of the technology, and the folks that were actually in the labs innovating on those technologies. And one of the sort of quotes we heard time and time again is that there were people in labs that were coming up with solutions to problems that didn't necessarily exist in the actual agricultural arena. And we wanted to make sure to sort of refocus those conversations so that the farmer at the end of the day that would be using those technologies, or the third-party project developer, would actually have some sort of influence over what it was the innovators were doing and thinking about when they were developing their technologies. The Nutrient Recycling Challenge was originally envisioned as a 4-phase prize competition, and the idea was we would move from concept to design to prototype and to demonstration. So moving to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about some of the activities that took place under the Nutrient Recycling Challenge and a little bit of an evolution of the challenge. So as I mentioned, we launched in late 2015, and essentially what we did is we went out to the world with a global prize competition, and we set out some criteria that we were asking folks to respond to and provide us with concept papers that would explain technologies that would recover nitrogen or phosphorus from dairy or swine manure, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. On the next slide, you can kind of see some of the criteria we laid out for the world. And ultimately, we ended up selecting 34 concepts from around the world to proceed on into phase 2 of the challenge out of a total of 75 concepts that were received and ultimately judged by a judge panel we put together. We completed phase 2 in 2017, and that was the design phase, and that was a non-competitive program of technical support. And again, I'll talk a little bit more about that as we move through the presentation. Throughout the first 2 phases of the challenge, we had significant feedback from the innovators and various producer groups that highlighted some additional barriers that we hadn't necessarily been thinking about at the very onset of the challenge. Yes, of course, high capital costs, high operation and maintenance costs, lack of markets for the products, and all of those things are very real barriers that we certainly hope many of you are working on and can help overcome. But we also realized that there were some other barriers, and some of those things included not necessarily being able to get access to funding or having a means to sort of speak with funders or potential funders and say, my technology does what I say it does because it's been evaluated by some third party. And back in the day, many years ago, there was a technology evaluation program at the Environmental Protection Agency, and we knew there were some out there, maybe not necessarily for the agricultural sector, but definitely in the wastewater treatment sector. And what we were learning was that there was a real hunger for that sort of program. So I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail when we talk about some of the ways we're planning on working together with the Water Research Foundation moving forward to build on the successes of the Nutrient Recycling Challenge. And I'm sorry if I went back a slide. I'm meant to be speaking from this slide, so this just indicates here that we had some re-envisioning discussions with the Planning Committee in 2017, and ultimately, rather than just driving to the demonstration phase for the sake of getting a handful of technologies on the ground, we really wanted to take some of the new barriers that we learned about pretty seriously and think about whether or not we might be able to add value there and provide something that didn't necessarily exist to help these innovators move from concept all the way to commercialization. As I mentioned, we went out to the world in phase one with some general criteria, and given that this was a concept phase, really just asking for concept papers, you can see this criteria is fairly general, looking for very simply a sort of narrative about how your technology would recover phosphorus and or nitrogen from dairy or swine manure in a usable form and do so in a cost-effective way. And then we provided a number of additional desirable characteristics that the innovators could indicate their technology was capable of achieving. So as I mentioned, we got 75 submissions in, and we were one of the more popular federal challenges on challenge.gov, which is the platform for innovation challenges in the federal family. And you can kind of see some pinpoints on the map here where our various concepts came from, so a good representation from around the globe. And here I'll move through these slides fairly quickly. I just wanted to call out that we awarded some prize money in this competition. So there were 4 winning concepts identified, as well as 6 honorable mentions that received a bit of prize money, and then the 34, including the 10 that I just showed you here, there were a total of 34 that were invited into phase 2, and all of those we thought were very promising technologies in terms of what they might be able to offer in the area of improved manure management and creating sellable products with these novel processes and technologies. Out of those concepts that we invited into phase 2 of the challenge, this just gives you an idea of what sort of technologies came in, very broadly speaking. Some technologies that could treat dairy specifically, fewer that could treat swine specifically, but a number of technologies that were identified as being potentially adaptable to both dairy and swine manure. We saw all of the major treatment technology classes represented, so mechanical, biological, chemical, thermal, and hybrid systems, and we saw technologies that could apply to very large farms and very small farms and anything in between. This list here just gives you an idea of the various concepts that came in, the types of products that were proposed that could be produced. So as you can see, a pretty wide array of products ranging from various energy products, bio-oils, biogas, syngas, all the way to the N and P fertilizers. Of course, you see struvite there, which we've mentioned a few times today, and then some of those other products like worm castings, compost, peat moss substitute, and various feedstuffs actually. And that was sort of one of the interesting things we learned as we were going through this process was there were some folks that were thinking about not just how nitrogen or phosphorus could be pulled out and used as fertilizer, but also as animal feedstuffs. We invited the 34 teams to join us in at the Nutrient Recycling Challenge DC Summit in 2016, and that was held at the Eisenhower Executive Office Building and World Wildlife Fund headquarters, and that's where we awarded those top 10 submissions, $30,000 in cash, and we wanted to provide a forum for the solvers or the innovators to meet the experts and some of the companies that you saw on the planning committee slide, so those dialogues could start where the innovators were having a chance to interact one-on-one with people who have actually tried and used these technologies and had very specific needs that they could relay to those innovators, hopefully influence the type of R&D that was happening going forward. And after that, we moved into the design phase, which was, as I mentioned, the non-competitive phase. And what we did here was we really wanted to sort of ground a number of the innovators in some of the the realities of manure management, for example. So you can see there in webinar 2, we had a webinar focused on, what is dairy and swine manure and how do you manage it, sort of 101 for those folks who are coming more from the waste treatment sector. We had a couple of talks that focused on building the business case for technologies and how you could potentially fund your technologies and what that might look like in the investor realm. And then some focus on anaerobic digesters, because so many of the technologies we were seeing said they could potentially work well with anaerobic digesters. And then I understand we're kind of running out of time, so I'm just going to move through those slides rather quickly. And again, my email is going to be provided on the last slide here, and feel free to reach out to me anytime with more questions you might have. I did want to just take a couple of minutes and talk about the EPA WRF MOU that Christine alluded to earlier. And I mentioned that we were in the early stages of the nutrient recycling challenge. One of the barriers we sort of identified was the lack of a technology evaluation program for these nutrient recovery technologies. And it was that sort of conversation that really got us thinking about how we might partner specifically with the Water Research Foundation, given our knowledge of some of the programs that the Water Research Foundation has in that exact area. So I called out a few on this slide. You can see the Leaders Innovation Forum for Technology, or the LIFT program, and the Facilities Accelerating Science and Technology, FAST programs. And essentially what those are, it's a means for municipal waste treatment providers to essentially talk to each other, learn a little bit about what other facilities have been trying in terms of technologies, have a conversation about whether technologies perform as touted, and the LIFT program providing that sort of platform to have new technologies that are just coming onto the market perhaps, but not widely deployed, a forum for those technologies to be evaluated by a panel of experts and judged against certain criteria, and essentially have a sort of determination made that the technology, yes, it does perform as touted, and here's the business case for the technology and its market readiness level, and all of those factors that someone would be interested in that are thinking about potentially adopting a new technology. So while the Water Research Foundation and EPA Memorandum of Understanding will and does focus more broadly on sort of activities across multiple watersheds, market-based approaches, watershed-based approaches to nutrient reductions more generally, in terms of a very concrete or tangible item we're hoping to move on relatively soon is to actually have some of the innovators that participated in the Nutrient Recycling Challenge move through the LIFT and FAST programs if they're interested in doing so. Some of them have already done so on their own, so out of the 34 teams that were invited into Phase 2, 10 have actually already submitted their concepts to LIFT, sort of independent of the challenge right after Phases 1 and 2. And so we want to make that opportunity available to the remainder of the challenge participants, give them an opportunity to have their technologies evaluated if they'd like, but also start to build out the conversation of are there any farms or farmers, and that can be both private, for-profit, privately owned farms, it can be test farms or academic farms that are located on various colleges throughout the country, but are there locations where we could potentially identify those locations as sort of testbed facilities where various technologies could be tried, and then information about technology performance relayed to other stakeholders in the sort of broader agricultural and innovator community. So with that, just wanted to quickly say, if you'd like to be involved, still plenty of opportunities to get involved, so help spreading, in quotation marks, the word. Of course, manure joke was necessary. Please help us with any connections to agricultural stakeholders. If you think we should be working with an organization that you didn't see in the planning committee, and just any ideas you have, please feel free to share them with me or Christine at any time. And as I mentioned, we do have some ideas about what we'd like to sort of tackle out of the gates with respect to the MOU and thinking through the capacity around LIFT and building some agricultural capacity there specifically. But we also have an MOU that's going to be in effect for several years, and we want to focus on a range of watershed and market shed-based approaches to nutrient reduction. So let us know if you have any ideas of what sort of work we might be interested in, what sort of work's underway already, and we can certainly entertain those ideas going forward and turn those things into tangible products. So again, included my contact information here as well as Christine's. Feel free to reach out at any time. And I can conclude with that. I just wanted to point out I have provided the Nutrient Recycling Challenge website. Sad to say, at the exact moment that this webinar is going on, the challenge page is actually down because challenge.gov is updating their web platform, but we hopefully expect to have that back up momentarily. So in the meantime, if there are any materials you'd like to see from phases 1 or 2, any questions you have, again, just reach out to me and I'll be happy to provide you with whatever information you're looking for. And with that, I'll conclude.
Okay, thank you, Joseph. Just a correction. For the Nutrient Recycling Challenge, I'm not the direct contact for that on the foundation. It's my colleague, Fidan Karamova, who works in our LIFT program. But I'm here. I'm tag teaming. I'm helping out where I can. But thank you, Joseph. And again, this MOU was signed, I guess, a month or so ago. It was a press release went out. I believe it's posted on EPA's website if people are interested in looking at it. But if you have thoughts, please pass them on to Joseph and I. Before I ask some final questions to our speakers, I have to do some gratuitous self-promotion for the foundation. As I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, we do have a number of resources available for you on WERF.org/nutrients if you're interested. The thing is, we are getting a new website soon, and I realized I just skipped a page. I did also want to give you a notification. Since you're on here, I assume you're interested in nutrients related. So here are some upcoming events. There's another webinar this Thursday that's going to be talking about cyanotoxin release. We actually have a webinar related to LIFT, which is on phosphorus recovery on a CalPrex demo. And then we have another webcast that we're doing in conjunction with WEF that's looking at water quality models for setting nutrient targets. And then, of course, April 5th is a big day. The Phosphorus Forum's happening. GIS-P is going to be launched and other things. And then EPA also does have another webinar on Nutrient Smart or N-Smart coming up in April as well. So I do recommend that you visit our websites. I'm going to leave this page up for now, but I do want to have some closing questions for our speakers. Because we are research, I want to hear from you guys. What do you think is the most pressing research needs that the foundation should be looking at, whether it's phosphorus or nitrogen or other recovery commodities? I'll start with Christian.
Yeah, I think so. I'm not a 100% researcher, so I see myself more the, let's say, the implementer. In terms of phosphorus, I think we are already on track. Of course, you can optimize everything, and that will never stop. So that's part of evolution anyway. But we had a discussion about all the concerns, be it organic or inorganic pollutants in different waste streams. What we noticed, especially if it comes to the organics, there's still a lack of data. So it's and especially if it comes to new regulation, which should, of course, be based on let's say, fact-based impact assessment, and of course, if it comes to pollutant risk assessment. So I can always just plead generate data. Of course, it has to be somehow managed and structured, so data alone will not help, so someone has to interpret them. So that's one thing. And then, of course, as mentioned before, nitrogen is, for me, let's say, the most prominent and upcoming issue, so that there's still a lot of work to be done.
Okay, thank you. Matt?
Yeah, I'd agree with what Christian just outlined, but I'd also come out of left field maybe with another one, which is an area that I don't think WERF has done a lot of work in, although probably some, which is hydrologic models. Those are really where the rubber hits the road. They're used to define allocations and model interventions and inform policy. And so they're good, the ones that we have now, but they really need a lot of improvement, especially in modeling the mobility of different forms of nutrients through the environment and connecting those small-scale practices, whether those are green infrastructure practices or on-farm practices, to watershed-scale outcomes. And so we really need these good models to gain buy-in from everyone that interventions will yield substantial benefits, and I think that would be a great area for WRF to tackle.
Thank you. Thank you, Matt. Joseph?
And I'm not avoiding the question of research, but as a policy person, I feel obliged to talk a little bit about, as much as the research is important, I think one of the things that the Nutrient Recycling Challenge has helped us do is recognize some of those major regulatory and policy either incentives or barriers, and then how different regulations and policies can create or take away, from essentially help with adoption or halt it. So I think we learned a lot, and to whatever extent as policy folks on the line can, sort of think about various programs they have, for example, grant programs that maybe fund innovative technologies. To what extent can those sort of policy folks across the country link up and think about clever ways to let producers know that there's potentially funding available through some of these programs, or if there's a specific question about a regulation, it's not just occurring in a void, it's tied to this bigger picture of how do we sort of turn phosphorus into a resource rather than a pollutant only. So just to expand the conversation on the policy front.
All right. Yeah, I agree. All good suggestions. We are out of time. Attendees, thank you so much for being here. Make sure you fill out the survey. One last thank you to Christian, Matt, Joseph, and Michelle. I hope you enjoyed this, and be sure to look out for the recording. Have a good day.